Bonsoir à tous et à toutes.
Good evening, one and all.
Film Queendom
You've just watched the film Queendom by Anya
Et donc, comme vous l'avez vu, ce
Galdanova.
film suit de près Jenna
As you
Marvin,
will
artiste
have noticed,
polydisciplinaire
the film is
russe
about Jenna
exilée à
Martin,
Paris pour fuir la conscription
multidisciplinary
suite à
artist
l'invasion de l'Ukraine.
who
Donc,
left
à travers
Russia
ce
to
film,
flee the Ukrainian
on
invasion
perçoit
and
que
went to
tout
Paris.
dans
We
l'identité de Jenna Marvin vient
see
transgresser
that
les règles strictes
everything about
d'une
Gina
société sous le joug
Martin's
Kremlin.
identity is a
Dans ce
transgression
contexte,
of
le seul
the
fait
tenets of the
d'être,
Kremlin. The
d'exister
very
et de
existence
paraître
of
semble
Gina
être,
Martin
pour
and
Jenna Marvin
their
comme pour tant
appearance
d'autres, une position
is
politique forte
a
face à
strong
l'ordre
political
établi
statement
qui
against
oppresse
the
et condamne.
establishment that oppresses and
Et la
condemns.
question que ça vient forcément
And the
susciter quand
question
on
that
connaît
this obviously
le
raises
contexte politique
when
actuel
one is aware of the
est la
current political
suivante.
context
Face à
is
la
the
montée du
following.
fascisme, dont les eaux
In the
troubles
face of the
débordent
rise of
déjà
fascism,
malheureusement
which is
ici et là,
spilling over,
pour les
unfortunately,
personnes déviantes des
into many
normes
countries,
dérivées
for
en
people
standards
who
et pour toutes les
deviate
autres
from
d'ailleurs,
norms and standards, and
comment
for everyone else,
peut-on
for that matter,
réinventer des luttes
how
justes
can we
et efficaces?
invent
Comment
just and
résister
effective
face au
struggles? How can
fascisme?
we resist
Et
fascism?
pour discuter de cette question et de toutes les
To
questions
discuss
évidemment qui
this
sont
issue
attenantes,
and all related
je vais
issues,
prier de me rejoindre
I
ce
would
soir
like to
sur ce plateau
invite
Farah
my
Youssef,
guests onto the
militante
stage, Farah Youssef,
transféministe et
transfeminist
travailleuse
militant
associative.
and associative worker.
Bonsoir Farah.
Good evening, Farah.
Bonsoir, ça fonctionne.
Good evening. Oh, it works. Hello, everyone.
Nous avons également à distance
We
avec
also
nous
have joining
Carlotta
us
Vagnoli,
remotely Carlotta
journaliste,
Vagnoli,
écrivaine et
who's a
militante
journalist,
féministe.
writer,
Je vous
and
prie
militant
aussi d'applaudir
feminist. I
Carlotta.
would ask you now to applaud Carlotta Vagnoli. Good evening.
Et nous avons enfin à nos côtés
And
Costanza
finally,
Spina, journaliste
Constanza
et
Spina,
auteuriste de
journalist
Manifeste
and
pour une
author of the
démocratie déviante.
Manifesto for a Deviant Democracy.
Bonsoir.
Good evening.
Et sans plus attendre, pour ouvrir cette
Without further
discussion
ado,
qui, à mon avis,
to
va
open
être
this
agitée
discussion,
pour
which
toujours
I'm
trop
sure
peu de
will
temps
be
finalement pour parler
very
de tout ça.
lively. There's always too little time to talk about
Je pense qu'il pourrait être
these
intéressant de
interesting
commencer par un état des lieux.
questions. I think it might be good to
On entend beaucoup le mot
have
fascisme.
an overview. We hear a lot of
D'après
talk about fascism,
livre, 10
and according
questions sur
to this
l'antifascisme,
book, 10
qui est un
questions
manuel
about
pédagogique et
anti-fascism, which is a
militant proposé par la Horde,
teaching manual
qui est
and
un
militant
collectif
manual
antifasciste
published
français
by La Horde,
de la
which
plus
is a
haute importance.
French
Il y a
anti-fascist
5
collective,
piliers
very
idéologiques au
important one.
fascisme. Le racisme,
Fascism,
le sexisme,
racism,
le
sexism,
le
nationalism,
traditionalisme
traditionalism,
et l'autoritarisme.
and authoritarianism are all
Considérant que ce
facets
sont
of
les
the
5
same
piliers du fascisme,
evil.
est-ce que vous pensez à cette table et évidemment Carlotta à distance
The 7 pillars of fascism.
qu'on puisse encore
Carlotta,
parler de montée du
do you
fascisme,
think we
comme
can
on le
still
dit souvent,
talk about the
ou est-ce
rise
que
of
le fascisme
fascism,
est finalement
or is
actuellement
fascism
déjà bel et bien
here
installé?
already?
Farah, est-ce que tu veux commencer?
Farah, would you like to take this question? Yes.
Je pense que il faut quand même parler
I think that we need to talk about the rise of fascism and use the right qualifier vocabulary, because even if in France the political situation is a tendency to Islamophobic laws, homophobic laws, the only criterion that allows people to qualify themselves is their degree of xenophobia or transphobia, independently of any objectivity. But France is still a country, if we talk just about France, with a neoliberal government, and its neoliberal approach attacks public service and all facets of the social fabric. In order to manage this legitimate public anger, currently in France, they're choosing scapegoats. Currently, these scapegoats are Muslims, and in LGBT community, I think that trans people are the most vulnerable to being used as scapegoats, and all LGBT people who deviate from norms are vulnerable. Yes, we're people like the others, and we have the same aspirations. We're not here to threaten your society, but that doesn't suffice. So the situation is rotten. It looks like fascism, but if fascism comes to power, or should I say when they take power, it will be worse. Carlotta, you're Italian. You're a journalist and activist in Italy. When do we see a shift towards official fascism? At what point?
In Italy, it's never left. There was a big problem in Germany after nationalism and what happened during the Second World War. We had it was a different situation because we have never been there. Currently, for several reasons, economic, political, and so on, there's a reawakening, a very strong one, of our roots, our fascist roots, which unfortunately never left. We have an extreme right government that is based on three pillars: God, the country, and the family, which reminds us very much of what fascism was back then. And the satellite parties of the government, also xenophobic and fascist, and we have a whole host of different rules that are affecting LGBTQ plus. The couples made of the same gender have had rights stripped of them. They've not been allowed to have children, and this has affected all of these people. The police has become much more aggressive, and Islamophobia, as was mentioned earlier on, is a huge problem in our country. There are protests to support the Palestinian people, and over the last few weeks, they have been controlled through blood. This is a huge problem, and I think that we can say that fascism has never left the country. It's we've never really, as a community, European community, taken a very strong stance against it and things that have been happening in our country.
Thank you, Carlotta. Constanza, you're very familiar with Italian society as well as French society. Why do you think that things aren't set out clearly in France, in a society where fascist dynamics are at play, including in the media? Why is the word not used? Yes, good evening. I'm Italian, but I've been living in France for the last 10 years. And my book, Manifesto for a Deviant Democracy, is written from a Franco-Italian perspective, and the word deviant is obviously a reference to Giorgia Meloni, who in 2022 said she wanted to fight the deviance of Italian youth. So it's a reference to her. For me, what's different in France compared to Italy is that clearly there's a neo-fascist government, and I'm not saying this because I'm a militant. Illustrious historians have defended this thesis as well, and I explain this in the book. I think that in France there has never been a fascist government after an endogenous fascist after a war, whereas Italy invented the word and the phenomenon and many other things as well. In France, I think there's knowing that Mussolini died in 1945, that his philosophy and his ideology died with him, but it's illusory. If you're a journalist or an analyst, it's obvious that ideologies don't die with their creator. There's absolutely no reason to think that that's true. Fascism is an ideology that is 100 years old, that has greatly evolved. Of course, we can expect to see fascists show up in black shirts, but in France, the CRS do wear dark-colored shirts, I have to say. The outward form of fascism is not the same, but when in France we see fascism coming back with certain folkloric images, that's naive. Fascism exists. There are fascist movements and demonstrations in France. It's time to shed this collective fear of naming the evil that exists in different forms. Farah, you said ironically that we were close to seeing a fascist party come to power and being elected in France. What place is there with this fear for people who have already been marginalized? Actually, none. If people like me have disappear, I think it will be seen as some kind of victory, because the fascist political project is one of social purification. Hello, I guess I'm corrupt. That's what I'm corrupting society, and we have to get rid of corruption. In concrete terms, what place would we have? Well, we will be pushed underground and into marginal positions even more seriously. We'll deal with it. We can still act from a very difficult social position, but it would make collective mobilization difficult if we were just trying to survive, and if we don't even have time or the wherewithal to think about personal development or fulfillment. This question is to all three of you. For all minority identities, can we say that homo-nationalism or femo-nationalism can be an attempt to save people who are in this position? Will people be tempted to try to go unnoticed? In my book, I developed the idea of confusionism, which is a technique of the contemporary far right, which is to hijack progressive ideas to attract new electorates. And femo-nationalism is one of these. So what they say is, if you're a feminist, you have to fight migrants, because migrants bring violence into the country. So this is a confusionist idea. And then there's essentialism and TERF. These are feminists who want to exclude trans people. I think that's a totally fascist idea, but it's closer to confusionism. These are language-based techniques to confuse people and win new voters over. Carlotta, are nationalism and femo-nationalism phenomena that we can observe? For a far-right-leaning woman, it might be very interesting to use feminism and the preponderant place that feminism is taking up in debates to get elected. Giorgia Meloni springs to mind immediately when I mention this.
Absolutely. Let's say that the whole campaign of Giorgia Meloni was based on this, or revolved around this. There was the TRF, of course, and that moved then to the majority, but the entire campaign was based on the role that she saw, without mentioning many of the details. It was very reassuring. Most of her ideas, transphobic and discriminatory, were always mitigated by her slogan, "I'm Georgia, I'm a mother, and I'm Christian." In her campaign, she decided to use friendliness to kind of try to convince those who were undecided to vote one way rather than another. And she didn't come across as such an unpleasant person. But then when power came, all changed. Wanted to be the president in masculine form, which was not the case before, so taking on a lot of masculine elements, and this is not that rare in our country. Many times they try to come across as the goodies, using the words that others want to hear, but they end up being terms that are used by the far right. They probably have realized that their terms are anachronistic, and to make them more contemporary, they end up using terms by movements such as the trans feminists. Their project really wasn't very appreciated, though.
What can we do when people who are subjected to the same oppression as us decide to fight their oppressors? How can you fight? Let me give example of allied men who say, if a woman says she's anti-feminist, it's none of my business. I can't tell her what to do. Or what about a heterosexual person talking to a homosexual person and who's anti-LGBTQ? These are very concrete cases. What can we do with these? Well, these are very tricky questions. How can I say this? If you're engaging in a debate on television with somebody who's in a token position and offers their personal experience to the oppressor, then of course we can try to pick their arguments apart. I'm not sure that a good thing to do to try to attack the person on moral grounds or on personal grounds. It might be very tempting to do so, and you might want to do it after the debate or if you get a chance to speak to them personally. But trying to damage their credibility, as a militant, I don't necessarily want to go too far into moral grounds, because if I were a purely intellectual entity with no physical incarnation, I could understand that for many reasons people might opt for that kind of strategy, even though it's very egotistical, very selfish. But that is not the real issue. The real issue is, can we provide them with alternatives and reasons to change sides, and perhaps just come back to a more altruistic position, or at least a position with empathy? What do you think, Constanza? This is a very complex question. I think that for having studied fascism very attentively and why people vote for extreme right candidates, I think one of the main motivations is fear. A lot of people are terrified by the state of the world today. And out of fear, they're going to turn to ideologies that promise some form of security without thinking that these ideologies are creating the very fear that is holding them captive. I don't know exactly what strategy to adopt. We can talk about this later, but I think the joy that you get being a militant, the joy of queer people, or just the joy that people feel, like we saw in the film, when people are living their real lives. This is something that makes me want to live, that makes me want to gain fulfillment. And I wonder who's happier, them or me? And frankly, I think I am. I'm absolutely sure that I'm happier than they are, because I'm not bitter. That was quite a punch. You talked about a vicious circle. Could it be based on a lack of knowledge or understanding in terms of fascism and its impact on the oppressed and the marginalized? For people to be able to read the signals, even if they're weak, it's not easy because militants catch what politicians and the media are saying. We know what they're talking about in actual fact, but the public doesn't. Dog whistle is something that the far right does. How can we educate the general public about fascism? Carlotta, I turn towards you, but I don't think you can actually see me doing that. It's a complex question.
Io osservo tutto, sono.
No, I can see everything. I'm a superior being, and I can see everything. No, joking apart, I think educating is something that's increasingly difficult. One of the projects that could have been useful in this sense would have been, let's say, working within the schools, because you need to work on a whole host of stereotypes that lead to fear and to the birth of ideologies that are detached from reality. So you need to start very early. I don't think that there is much being done in terms of introducing new courses within schools. Sorry, I can hear the translation in French, and it's bothering me a little. So the Italian government has excluded some courses, like on gender equality, for example. There are other issues, like the courses on sexual education. LGBTQ+ members are not in an easy place with regard to these courses in the schools. So in terms of means of communication in Italy, we're doing our best. But as I've said earlier, there is a problem regarding the repression carried out by the Italian police. We have things happening now that remind us of what has happened in the past. So I think we need to be working on our culture, working on freedoms, but unfortunately things aren't going in the right direction for a whole series of different reasons. But currently the situation is extremely complex, and it requires action on different fronts to do away with all of this. Thank you.
Yes, but once the far right is ensconced and has taken over all of society, will it be possible to have a debate? Because a few years ago, people were saying, I don't want to get my hands dirty. Talking to them is to give them legitimacy. But once they're ensconced, what can we do? Will they even want to talk?
Je pensais que c'était une question spécifiquement pour Carlotta.
I thought that was a question for Carlotta. No, it's an open question.
Mais faut-il débattre avec l'extrême droite?
Should we discuss things with the far right? Yes, we should always talk with everyone, but it's a good idea to establish some guidelines and stick to them, because during the last French presidential election, I was very surprised to see that some of the smaller media outlets and in political science schools and journalist schools went out to see the far-right candidates and covered their platform as if it were any other platform. So if we really need to discuss things with them and deal with them, I think we need to set some ground rules, because lives are depending on this. Maybe these are not lives that are very representative, but they're lives that slip through the net and the safety net, especially. So I think we have to have a minimum number of standards and criteria. Constanza, what arguments can you use with the far right without normalizing the far right or giving it legitimacy?
I decided, as many people have done here, well, I wrote these books because I was absolutely fed up with this kind of phenomena where the far right is treated the same as any other political party. So I dove into the history of fascism, and I wondered, why can't we call fascism fascism? And it has been said by others that to fight something, you have to name it. And so the first tool, in my view, is words. And I'm fine discussing things with Marine Le Pen and Giorgia Meloni, but I want to be able to say to Giorgia Meloni, you come from a party that is neo-fascist. I'm not inventing it. This is the history of her party. If those conditions are laid out, then why not? But as Farah said, is it useful? Are we not normalizing things, going to talk with people who want us to disappear? And that's what we were saying earlier on. I think there probably are allies who could go and talk in a candid way with these people without it affecting the debate, but by using the right terms. But personally, it would have meant a huge mental load for me. So what I did is I worked on different speeches made by people over the years. Elisabeth Badinter said atrocious things on France Inter, and I kind of answered her back one sentence at a time in my book. Well, you've just made me think of something. Yes, fascism isn't an intellectual stance. You can have a discussion, given what they're talking about things that are irrational, talking about passions, about aesthetical, political projects that we want to see come to light. Given that we're in this irrational field, let us deal with it in an irrational way, but talking about it as though it was socialism or any other type. They don't try to cause us to disappear. So there's this tension between rational and irrational that I wanted to come back to. I have something to say. You just made me think about it. This is the thesis I had, the theory I had at the end of my first book. It's a kind of paranoia. It's not an intellectual theory. The far right is not a political program. It is a way of thinking with cognitive biases, and it leads to people adhering to a belief which is a kind of cult. There was one neo-fascist in Italy in 2022. His slogan, the slogan of his party was, "I believe." can we really go and talk to people who are in the midst of paranoia, who have thought mechanisms of that type? Carlotta, how do you approach these people, or what stance do you have in terms of communicating with these people? Well, my idea is quite radical in that respect. I find that with some people, such as our government or people from some satellite parties of the government, from Forza Nuova to others, such as Casabound, there's little to say. So having a dialogue means us entering an approach that is related to hatred, and unfortunately, that makes things a little difficult. However, it is paradoxical that we journalists do not have the same way of being able to ask questions to Salvini or Meloni. There was a conference, press conference on the 5th of January by Giorgia Meloni, as always at the beginning of the year, and Meloni took a bit of time to speak to the journalists about the year that had just ended. We've had she said nothing bad, and yet there were catastrophes that took place in the previous year in Italy. No difficult question was asked her, nothing difficult to answer, and that just shows how difficult it is for us to deal with fascism. So I believe that we need to find new formal spaces that are truly inclusive, and I'm suffering from this at the moment because I don't believe that such spaces exist anymore.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. This discussion in the face of fascism led to a lot being published on the internet in France of late. And we've heard people speak of militant police. Thought it would be interesting to come back to this idea and what is militant purity, so to speak. I wanted to mention this book, Joie Militante, by Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery, translated by Juliette Rousseau. We're in chapter 4. Burnout and political performance, and they talk about this militant purity that I would like us to come back to. These are the terms. Something is happening in many spaces and movements and radical movements. It's taking their energy from the center. It's the pleasure of feeling more radical than the others and the fear of not being radical enough. There is the apprehension of seeing errors in oneself and in others, the social networks and social media with the many likes and dislikes, the fear of seeing something new, and curiosity is seen as naive and condescendence is seen as appropriate. It can be seen as difficult to talk about all this publicly. We can be labeled reactionary or oppressive. Many discussions on this topic take place, but the people involved need to be sure that they won't be considered suspect or criticized immediately. It's a matter of leaving place to subtleties and normalities which are most often absent when rigid radicalism takes over. The interpreters have done their best, but unfortunately we did not have the text made available to us ahead of time, and we're not aware of quotes being given. this is rather a taboo subject, so I'm not too sure what your comments are on this. Well, rigid radicalism. I've met people who were affected by this. I myself have been in situations of rigid radicalism. It's not something that fundamentally affected my work as an activist, either within associations or as activism that is related to producing knowledge or analysis. But what can be said is that, how should I put this? Well, at what point does it discourage people from committing? Well, I think amongst activists, there is a way of being, a sort of savoir-faire. And when you first turn up in such an environment, you may not have the right codes to begin with, and you may end up spending a lot of time trying to reproduce these codes rather than trying to understand them or maybe even reinventing them. So I think that if we want to find a solution to this, not sure. Maybe it's a kind of doubtful parallel. I get the impression that it's related to the fact that LGBT and queer are in the outside world, in the dominant world, playing around with rules to do with respectfulness, and then we recreate rules in our own spaces. And I don't know. I think that the work of reinventing and criticizing or not is not impossible, but difficult. And I am more concerned about our relationship with our those who dominate us, rather than what happens at an intra-community level, even though I don't want to minimize that either, because all too often, unfortunately, we turn to exclusion. The exclusion of somebody who's causing problems is it's kind of distancing oneself.
So if you're facing dangerous political enemies who have a lot of power and who are untouchable, couldn't this lead to a desire to request accountability from those who are more reachable and who may be seen as representing this oppression? Constanza, you were nodding. Yes, for me, Farah said the word transformative justice. In my book, I give a lot of room to alternative justice. I talk a lot about alternative justice because we'll never beat the far right unless we decide what justice means for us. We all think we're right. So what is just? What is just for us? So for me, it was important to ask myself the question. And I had to face the question of militant purity. And I wrote an essay, but I've decided not to publish it for now, for the time being, because I'm angry and I don't want to just to vent. But what made me angry was, as you mentioned earlier, these dynamics of militant purity were aimed at attacking people who are easier to reach than the real enemies. Militant purity is a classist and normative tool, often performed by people who can afford to do so. Even though I understand, and I've been in radical mindsets and not being conciliatory at all, and I can understand that. You have to be radical at some times. But this militant purity, this idea of checking each other out and seeing if they're okay, seems to me to be a bit similar to what I experienced at church when I was a child, where you were always made to feel guilty for who you are and what you were, who you were and what you were. And I just want to feel comfortable in the community that I live in. Even in the queer community, I don't want to be made to feel bad. And my last point is that I think here we're in a group where people can tell the difference, but there's also violence in the queer community. And what shocked me was that how often militant purity goes with a form of incoherence in terms of the violence can take place. In my chapter on the liberal mechanisms that are in place, if we want to fight fascism, we have to overcome our own desire to dominate and become dominant. And we can do this by trying to practice radical tenderness rather than radical purity. Purity is not a very nice word to start with.
On vient toucher un peu aux thématiques.
Well, we've just touched upon the topic of burnout and fatigue. Carlotta, you are highly exposed in your work. You're on the front lines vis-à-vis the government. Is the struggle constant? When can you decide to pull back when the struggle is so urgent and so vital for so many people?
Sicuramente anche in Italia, così.
In Italy, as is the case in the West, I think when a feminist comes out of the group, I'm white, heterosexual, etc., then they start getting invited to these debates, but they end up being relatively violent, and one ends up being exposed. Let me give you a concrete example. A couple of days ago, we were making a presentation with another activist. We were followed by the police. They were trying to understand what our next movements were going to be, where we were heading. We were working in our city, and I think that having an eye on people can be problematic not only for the woman but for the movement on the whole. It can make things extremely difficult, and I think that one thing we need to keep in mind is that when we're out on the front, especially in political situations, journalism and TV programs and so on, our voice is not of huge interest. Then you need to look at what follows and how exposed you are. And I think that mental health in that respect is a priority. It's a fundamental topic, but community and family is as well. In these situations, we often end up feeling very lonely and isolated. And I think that sharing your situation and story helps you bear the burden. I think having more of a community discourse, even in the trans-feminist movement, would be helpful. It would give us more space and also broader shoulders, and we could also give some people a rest and give more of a voice to others, because some are not heard or are not heard in certain places. So not always seeing the same 10 faces would be a major symbol of inclusiveness.
So it's about getting away from pure political performance and building community and helping one another. Farah, how can we enhance care in the context of a struggle by people who are already damaged or in difficulty because of their identity, because of their background and their experience? How can we give priority to care? I think that in order to value care, we have to create the proper conditions. Ideally, there would be pooled resources and shared areas or spaces. This is what I think, but I'd like to come back to the question of destructuring. This is what gives us the opportunity to create and to create sustainably. I'm thinking about the fact that in transfeminist militantism, which I'm familiar with, there is this idea of standing in for the public service. And not only do you stand in for the public service and provide the services, but participate in healing people to whatever extent possible. I don't have any better answers than that because these are questions I'm thinking about as well. So care is necessary in an ongoing and long struggle. Yes, well, we just have to experiment. It's trial and error. What I can say is that in militant structures and associations, care is not valued properly. And in another situation where there's more time, it's thought to be important, but we never see that time being free. I think that there are people militating for taking better care and taking care differently, but it's about time to Constanza. In your book, A Manifesto for a Deviant Democracy, you make observations, very interesting ones about fascism, but there's a note of hope, a great deal of hope, in fact. Your book talks explicitly about injecting love into struggles and into communities that are struggling. You talk about radical tenderness. Is this a concept that you can say more about? Yes. The second half of the book is devoted to what I call the romantic, queer, and intersex revolution. I explained it in the book. It's been stolen by certain feminists that have made it into a concept where heteronormative love is recreated. The idea is to understand that there are different ways of loving as queer people, and that we can bring these into our daily lives. For example, what would queer justice look like? Loving justice. Maybe it would be justice without a prison system. And the idea of radical tenderness, I talk about it in the book, but I've learned a lot since I published the book. Radical tenderness is a way to treat our bodies, because we often forget that people who are struggling are using their bodies to struggle. So treating our bodies with care and love, and building spaces for sexuality, intimacy, which are alternative spaces which make it possible to give tenderness to our bodies and to others, and remain in a position of political radicality. There are therapists who are trained in practices in touching for transformative experiences and in dealing and healing trauma. Very interesting ideas. There's also the spiritual aspect, because these practices come from different spiritual and religious currents from the world over. So we also need to take up these questions and think about the cultures that have produced them. I think that's very important. The very last chapter of your book is queer hearts are divine incarnations. Why did you use this sentence? Because I think it's good for queer people. How can I put this? For me, it was powerful to show that even in religion, queer people can find a space for themselves. Even that we can take away from the fascists. And we can inject queerness into spirituality and mysticism. What I meant specifically by this sentence, I come from a Catholic background. My family's from Sicily, and there are spiritual practices that are not just Catholic. They're mixed with other Mediterranean traditional practices. And what I was trying to say was that when I was a child, I was taught that God was a Trinity, and the Christian dogma of the Trinity says that we have the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, no women anywhere on the horizon, that God was three people. And the priest would always say to me, yes, but nobody understands this. Only God can understand what this means. Only God can know what it is like to be three people in one. And that's not true. When you think of non-binary people, trans people, no, queers understand perfectly what it means to be several people in the same body, to be fluid, to be in transition. And I said to myself, it was just because priests are cisgender men and heterosexual. We queers understand this very clearly. So I think that the queer heart is, for me, what is the closest thing to a divine incarnation. Carlotta probably knows Nicola Moggia, the Italian feminist who has written a lot about religion and queerness. She wrote a book called God Save the Queer, in which she expounds on this question. So I thought it was interesting for me to cover in my book as well.
Cette question du coup de la religion.
So religion and spirituality that you talk a lot about at the end of your book, it's another way of building a community as well and gathering people together. Aside from the struggle and the confrontations, it's a deep way of connecting people together. Yes, in Marseille, we set up a prayer group, a queer prayer group. A trans person called Jonas is the head of it. It's a multi-denominational group, and at one of the last meetings, we're in Lent now, and Ramadan is starting tomorrow. So we had a prayer session mixing Lent practices and Ramadan practices, and it was wonderful. It was a session where we really cared for the other communities. People said what their intentions were, what they needed, how we could support each other. And it's a different way of building a community. Carlotta, given the current climate of oppression in Italy, are there new forms of struggle and communities emerging?
Allora, volevo intanto rispondere a...
Well, I wanted to answer what was said just now, because it is true that cis feminism is abusing of the term queer, which is now used for in all kinds of situations to refer to even the family. It's been usurped, and I hope that this debate takes greater strength over the weeks and months to come. In fact, there is a colleague along with Claudia Fauci, an activist from Sicily, who is they are both also starting to talk a lot about this problem and the fact that the term queer has been used and overused in a whole series of different situations. Now, as to the other topic, feminism, we're beginning to talk about the various territories in Italy with their different resources and accessibility and different ways of understanding life within the communities. And we're starting to work on this, and this more territorial discourse is gaining in strength. In Italy, we are endeavoring to include different people in our protests, people with neurodegenerative diseases or issues and different disabilities. And currently, a lot is being done for people from Palestine. It's not been covered by the press, but the Palestinian people's dignity has not been protected. And in Italy, we are beginning to talk about it more and more. So I think that gradually things are possibly beginning to move. Regarding feminism, we started things a little late. We were very much white feminists. And luckily, we're beginning to build things amongst ourselves without any real call-out. Without some of the readings that I've done, I wouldn't be constantly challenging myself and learning. And I think this is one of the greatest things that happen with feminism. And I see things evolving, and I'm very happy about that. I think that finally things are being built up.
Et on le voit, c'est une évolution.
We've seen this. It's a structural change, or really a structural change in a context where there's no hierarchy. Everyone can speak on behalf of the movement, and sometimes the regulatory mechanisms take a while to emerge. But there are other forms of struggles. Farah, you were talking about, I really liked it, so I wrote it down. Moving past morosity and coming out of apathy. Constanza, you talked about love in communities that fight the fight together. We have seen that there is the fight through art, which was developed in the film that you saw an hour ago. Could we imagine that militantism might work through love or joy? Absolutely. When I was organizing the gay pride in the suburbs, I remember being enthusiastic in my work and trying to convey this enthusiasm to my colleagues. And some people were just along for the ride, it seemed. But personally, this is something which I've lost slightly, but I'm no longer in a collective entity, and I feel like a fish out of water because of that. But clearly, I don't know if it's true for all associations. I don't think that everyone has to be playful and joyous, but it's a way of nurturing insolence and makes you a bit more resilient. I think it makes us a bit more, a bit sturdier. Sorry, I guess I haven't been speaking to the microphone, but my voice is quite loud. So, as you were saying, we queers have a lot of like experiences. We are very used to negotiating and adapting and coping. So it's not as if adopting joyful or playful practices would be something new for us. This is something we do already. It's just in a more circumscribed context, a context that seems morose because we have to talk about politics, but politics is just getting organized to do things together in a given area. Why could it not be playful and joyous as well? Constanza, can this joy be found in a community that you build for its solidity, faced with morosity?
Yes, I'd just like to open a small parenthesis here. I'd like to make the most of having another Italian here and me being on mic, just to come back to what she was saying about the southern part of Italy. I know that in France and in Switzerland we probably don't talk about this much, but I don't think that Italy will be a functional democracy until that side of things has not been sorted out, until we haven't acknowledged the destruction, the discrimination and the horrors that we experienced when the south of Italy was conquered. My father, just a few years ago, was beaten up because of our past, and it is something that's affected me throughout my life and still makes me quite uptight. So thank you for having brought this matter up here tonight. And I think it all depends on how history is told, and the history of Italy is not told the right way. But to come back to your question, yes, obviously coming together brings joy. This year I have massive health problems, and the queer community in Marseille has been absolutely outstanding. And I think that if I'm still here to say so, it's because so many people came to me to see me in the hospital, and it was really quite funny because there was a cultural abyss between the queer people there and the staff at the hospital, but they did it anyway, and it was absolutely wonderful. And it's a huge amount of energy that comes through love. Love brings energy and gives energy, and I'm a strong believer in this. My Italian family moved to Marseille to be close to me, and there was this amazing mix of my queer friends and my family. When I came out of the operating theatre, when I was recovering, I was almost in a coma, and I felt this community around me. I felt it very strongly. In fact, I had the impression that there were these angels around me, and they were queer. So I am a believer, and I am very optimistic about our future. Thank you for those concluding remarks. And with those beautiful words, I think that we will turn to the audience and see if they have any questions. I know the first one is always difficult to ask. I wanted to come back to the link with religion and being queer. I recently learned, well, rather, I realized that Jeanne d'Arc, a few years ago, was seen in France as a leftist. She was from the left, short hair, and men's clothes. So I'm wondering about the right and the far right being able to take ownership of concepts from the left to do with feminism and so on. So I just wondered what you have in mind. Do you have anything to counterattack this? I think it would be very hard for the left to take ownership of symbols of the right, whereas the opposite is much easier. So I wanted to have your opinion about this. And I just feel it's a shame that Jeanne d'Arc is now Jean-Marie Le Pen.
Il me semble qu'il y a un historien, du coup.
I think there's a historian, a French historian, who worked specifically on Jeanne d'Arc and placed him on a continuum that was a transmasculine continuum. Is that what you wanted to mention? Well, sorry, I was there first. Clovis Maillet is the name of the historian. I think it's super important to dare take ownership of these figures that are so dear to the right and to the conservative spheres with a fascist tendency and neo-fascist tendency. So when you rediscover things that you maybe weren't expecting, like transmasc Jeanne d'Arc. I wasn't expecting that. And in terms of communities, well, it can shed light on social dynamics, concrete dynamics that existed even in the Middle Ages. And when we have discussions on trans-identity and so on, we're aware of the arguments used to place trans where they are placed, but we don't have a non-temporal history. That doesn't make sense, but it's not something that has only existed in the modern era. It's been around for a while now, taking ownership of religious symbols. It's maybe a little difficult for us, queer. We don't have the support of the religious sphere. We maybe have the support of our families, but we still need to get the support of the religious arena, and that's going to be, it's going to be difficult. Constanza, did you want to add something? No, I fully agree. And in my book, I do briefly speak of Jeanne d'Arc, saying clearly that Jeanne d'Arc is actually a victim of patriarchy. She's somebody who was raped and abused, and she's a bit like Saint Agatha of Catan. These are figures of saints that we can take ownership of. And in my prayer group in February, when it was Saint Agatha's day, we wrote poetry about her, and I think that is a way of taking ownership of it. It is true that we don't have the support of the religious sphere, but we don't have the support of many others either. So why don't we just keep going? Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room? Unfortunately, the question is being asked without a microphone, so the interpreters cannot hear it.
Vous vouliez en dire plus?
You wanted to say more? I do sculpture. I'm an artist. I was very affected by this person. Unfortunately, the person is speaking off mic, so the interpreters are unable to work. I think in art you can say a lot with that aesthetic activism.
Vous voulez parler de la notion du militantisme par l'art?
Would you like to talk about activism through art? This is a topic that was portrayed clearly in the film.
J'ai un travail aussi de journaliste.
Well, I have a job as a cultural journalist too. I work for Manifesto 21. It's a media that is highly interested in the queer artistic world, and it's an interesting question. Activism through art is definitely a very interesting approach. What I was struck by in the film was the courage of this person exposing their body to the public arena despite reactions. And you see him on Instagram, but he's in the street, and that's what really affected me. It was the strength of the courage of placing a bothersome body in the public sphere. And I don't want to compare France with Russia, but I do think that a person such as the person in the film, if they did that in Italy, I think they would be the target of a lot of violence, similar violence. That's my feeling anyway. Carlotta, is this something that you would like to talk about? Well, yes, no doubt it is true that we are still far from the Russian situation, although we probably will reach it in terms of our anti-LGBTQIA+. We're already in a bad situation. I am sure that the body can transmit many messages. Drag activism, it's called. Drag can get messages across, but the dangerous nature of using movements, gestures in your body to get messages across is dangerous. Maybe it hasn't ever been portrayed in the past through film, and it's certainly not possible to do so as realistically as reality in the film. There is one example I think of art in a room where weapons were handed out, knives, guns, and so on. And there were situations where there was blood and the person had to leave the room. So I think that many bodies are marginalized, especially queer bodies. When queer people try to do art, their body is often involved. The two are never really separate.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Est-ce que quelqu'un veut poser une question?
Would someone else like to ask a question?
Merci beaucoup pour cette super table.
Thank you very much for this excellent panel.
Une demande un peu par rapport à la Suisse.
I have a request regarding Switzerland, very concrete. Switzerland, maybe you're not as familiar with our political situation. We have the UDC, which is the party which has a majority of the seats in parliament. It's a far-right party, but it's very difficult to call it a far-right party in the media because they've been in power for a long time in Switzerland. There are representatives in a large number of representatives, and it's very difficult in the media to call the UDC a far-right party, even though by their platform they definitely are. It's not new that they're in parliament. They have a certain respectability, and so it's hard to take them down in the media. Would you have a strategy to fight this kind of unmerited respectability? How can we fight a fascist party that has been in power for so long in Switzerland? I think, as you said earlier, we have to look at the overall history, and I think that UDC, when the party grew up, if you look into it, probably was associated with far-right groups, fascist groups, supremacist groups, because all far-right parties in Europe are banking on this ambiguity today. So place them in a clear historical continuum. If we can do that, it's the first pillar of a viable strategy. Then you can analyze their discourse, the tropes they use, their speeches, their political measures they propose to retrace their past and their present and interpret the very fascist motives that they have. I don't know if that answers your question satisfactorily. Carlotta, do you have any ideas about how to fight this?
In Italia non si vogliono sentir chiamare fascisti.
Well, in Italy, they don't like it when we call them fascists, even though they have statues of Mussolini in their homes. Marcello Russa uses the Nazi salute, but he doesn't want to be called a fascist. When I am asked to write an article, I mock them. I call them the right party. You can't be any further right. They're to the far right of the far right. You can't get any further to the right. So it makes them look a bit ridiculous, and it sounds a bit ridiculous, but I think it's good to show them how shameful it is that they don't even admit to being far-right and fascist. It's a way of another way is to analyze their speeches and to look for ways to deconstruct their speeches and discourse. I don't know about Switzerland, but if the press could find the skeletons in the closet, that would be a good way to attack them as well, because fascists always have skeletons in the closet. Yes, throughout many countries, the right always wants to look like it's further to the left. The people on the left don't want to, and the others, especially in France, don't seem to care. Well, no stand-up comedy, but we do have time for one final question, and I hope it's a good one. I think that the right's rhetoric is simple. They play on people's passions, they call on their emotions, and on the left, we have more theory, more complicated long words that are not necessarily accessible to neurodivergent people or people who didn't grow up in wealthy or educated families. So they can't necessarily read the books and articles written by the left. So how can we make the left more accessible to a greater number of people. Because people who vote right or far right, it's easy to say that they're idiots, but maybe they don't have the wherewithal to understand the issues. So what about this? What about the progressive mainstream? That's an excellent question because it's a question about how to fight populism. Populism is really what characterizes the modern fascist movement. And Christian Taubira, who's a well-known figure on of the French left, said a few years ago, the left has lost the battle of words. I have two very clear ideas about this. The first is that we're in a space where we're talking about democracy and human rights here, but we haven't talked about journalism and the media. Very little in any case. I think we have to create media, we have to support queer media, we have to inject a lot of money into this and stop saying, no, I'm queer, but I work for mainstream media. No, we need help in the queer media. We need hands and boots on the ground for a certain type of journalism because often this journalism is geared towards people who are different, who don't have PhDs. The other thing I wanted to say is that we can't fight Matteo Salvini, who always uses three-part sentences and then gives a radical solution. To fight somebody who talks the way he does, like your fascist uncle at Sunday dinner, because that's the level we're talking about, you have to send out the big punchers, the heavyweights. Somebody whose rhetoric is very effective with strong, punchy comebacks. Maybe if we send figures who are not trying to undo all their arguments, but just fighting with quick comebacks. Edith Schlein, who's the president of the Democratic Party, the left-wing party, when they talk, it's like, well, if you can imagine Meloni and Edith Schlein, it would be like a boxing match. So why not? We need funnier, punchier rhetoric. I agree with Farah. We need more humor. We need panache, because that is also what's going to attract people and also make our discourse more accessible. Carlotta, how can we maintain this energy, the momentum of this energy? Because we see this in these talk shows and that the left is seen to require a huge intellectual effort. When Jean-Marie Bigard, the comedian, makes dirty jokes on stage, they're easy to understand, and people laugh even though he's a huge misogynist. Sorry, that was a French aside, Carlotta, but how can we maintain the level of energy?
In Italia non lo sappiamo fare.
We don't know how to do that in Italy. In Italy, with the left, we're just shit, if you don't mind me using that word. The Democratic Party taken a whole host of ideas from left, but they have problems of communication. They're always in touch with higher society, and they've totally lost contact with what the left should be in a country, workers, and so on. There is no longer the typical leftist discourse. We don't know how to do that anymore. We would need a generational change in all political parties, especially in the left, or completely close down the Democratic Party and start again with something new. There are some smaller parties that could no doubt be more young and less anachronistic. Unfortunately, the left in Italy is too anachronistic, so that's a major problem in Italy. I think that what we would need is a complete change, but one that would be effective, not looking to find the least bad amongst people who've been in the political parties for the last 20 years or more.
Bon, Farah, alors, avec tout ce qu'on a en France dans le champ politique.
Farah, with the political spectrum in France, what can we do? What can we do, and how can we get them to react? How can we fight the facile discourse of the far right that is very accessible to young people? Yes. The far right and the fascists wear us down. That's how they work. They occupy the terrain in the media, in intellectual spheres, but I'm talking about their interactions. For example, the RN in France, the far-right party, is seen as the party of the nice workers who but in fact, it's a bourgeois party, and their platform is very bourgeois. There's nothing socialist in it at all. It was written in a manor house, yes, in a stately home. Yeah, well, that says it all, doesn't it? And since they occupy the terrain, and they are always there over time, even if you hate the far right, if you have a difficult event in your life, you're left with nothing. What's left? Pascal Pro on television telling you that the real problem is the immigrants and all these deviant people. So what we have to do to share out the work is to deal with the real and surpass the real. And surpassing it through art, through spirituality, through creating something apart from fatalistic ideas. And dealing with reality is getting collectively organized, or community support, doing advocacy work. What else? Producing knowledge, translation as well, because we said that they're perhaps popularizing articles and books that are fundamental for understanding. People who can give us what we really need in the social sphere, which is mediation. So it's a big program, and just thinking about it makes me feel tired. But we don't have any choice, friends. We've got to go for it.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who has taken part in the discussion. Thank you to our brilliant panelists, Farah, Constanza, and Carlotta. Thank you.
Grazie.